Dr. Jaya for maybe that very long introduction. It is my distinct pleasure to give this year's keynote address for, as I said, a very noble and laudable effort, the 7th edition of Athenaeum. And the topic I've chosen, which is very close to my heart, what I teach, what I write about, it's on trade, technology, and economic transformation. I don't assume people in the audience to know a lot about economics, and those of you who will know a lot of economics, please bear with me. But since this is a management school, I thought it's important to give some context to why I'm talking about what I'm talking. So I think we are in the midst of maybe one of the most major transformations of recent times. And economists, when we study our discipline, we normally bring it back to the mid to late 18th century. It doesn't mean that economic forces didn't exist prior to that. After all, our own Kautilya wrote Arthashastra, and Aristotle gave the word economics, so going back to the Athenian days. But when we talk about economics, modern economics, it's only about 300 odd years old. And part of it is because of the first major transformation that took place, which is the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe in the 1750s. So prior to that, certainly there was trade. After all, the Chola dynasty traded, the Romans traded, the Greeks traded. There was market activity, but it was not what we would call economics. It is what was often called commercial statecraft. So when I am talking about economics, the dating of what we refer to as economic forces really can go back to somebody like Adam Smith, who is somebody, when we turned over the millennium in 2000, National Geographic did a survey of who are the 100 more influential people of the millennium, not of the last year, I'm talking 1,000 years. So you can imagine people like Gandhi made it in the top 10, but the only economist in the 100 was Adam Smith at number 20, right? And so there's a reason why I just want to start. And his famous book, which most economists claim to have read, but it's worth reading if you have time. It was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Right? It's a very long title. Most people refer to it as the Wealth of Nations. Now it is very important when you think about the title, because he didn't call it the money of nations. He didn't call it the income of nations. He called it the wealth of nations. In other words, the fundamental job of economic policy, or from the economic perspective, is how do you create wealth? Money is just a way to express that, and economists don't worry about money. Money has been lots of things. Currency is the newest form of money, but historically money has been lots of things. Wealth is what your resources can do with your human labor, with your mind, with your machinery, with your land. That is ultimately how wealth gets created. And more importantly, how do you create productive wealth, right? So this is the ultimate key for any economic success, is how do you create productive wealth. And so this very carefully it was designed why he calls it an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And one would argue that at that time when he was writing it, when he was witnessing the Industrial Revolution that was unfolding, it was putting a premium on how to use resources, because previously what was arable land for farming could now become a factory site. So in the last 300 years, as progress has exponentially gone up, the pressure on what you can do with resources becomes incredibly important, unlike the first thousands of years of human existence. So that's one reason why the study of economy becomes more paramount in the last 300 years. So the first major transformation starts around the 1750s with the expansion of Industrial Revolution. Smith has many, many contributions. I'm just going to say a few things and then move on. His biggest contribution was articulating how a market economy gets formed. Right? So we, once again, like economics, we've had markets. After all, village markets like Chennai has been existent in India for time immemorial, and Greeks and Romans had markets. That's not what I'm talking about. A market is nothing but, to an economist, a context. It doesn't have to be physical, like a village market. It has to be a context in which buyers and sellers, they sell goods and services across space, across time. Right? So you could have an oil market, and price of oil is in the news every day. Buyers and sellers of oil come from all around the globe. So markets exist across space, across geographies. Insurance markets exist across time. So markets is just a context. So when you're talking about the collection of markets, the fundamental question is how does the decision get made as to what to produce, how to price it. In a market economy, there is no one single person. And this was the beauty. This we now take for granted. But at the time of Smith's writing, it was one of the most revolutionary concepts that there had to be no king, or there had to be no czar, or there had to be no feudal lord, or there had to be no one person who was dictating what was to be priced, how was it to be produced, and so on. So the idea that each of us makes up a market economy is maybe one of the most revolutionary concepts in social sciences, not just economics. And that each of us don't get up in the morning saying, I need to do this. Each of us gets up in the morning to do our daily job. But in doing so, the activities get coordinated in such a manner that the collective welfare is promoted. And Smith used a wonderful phrase called invisible hand. It is as if an invisible hand is guiding all of us, and all we are doing is responding to signals. Right? So if the price of something goes up, and if I'm a seller, I am enticed to incentivized to produce more. If the price of it goes up and I'm a buyer, I consume less. So we are just responding to signals. And we are hardwired, brain-wise, we are hardwired to respond to scarcities. And so what Smith's beauty was to talk about how this market economy is being coordinated without a single actor, one person, right? So the market is nothing but a mirror that reflects us. That is his most important salient contribution of the Wealth of Nations. The second important contribution was the emphasis on the word competition, right? We hear the word compete all the time. You know, sportsmen compete in Olympics, in World Cup, and this and that. Businesses are competing. So competition is to economists what gravity is to physicists. Without gravity, I won't be standing here, you won't be sitting here. It maintains order in the physical world. Competition likewise maintains order in the economic world. And competition does four things. It reduces prices, it improves quality, it increases variety, and it promotes innovation. Right? So think about all of us now carrying around a handset, a mobile cell phone. Right? Think about what competition in that space has done. The incredible variety of handsets in terms of data plans, in terms of in terms of mobile density. That's what competition is all about, right? So now it's interesting, we have a competition policy in India as opposed to monopolies, restrictive trade practices. So the opposite of competition is policy, is monopoly. So the idea is how do you promote competition that's fair and regulated by some entity like the government. But competition is very critical. And that was the second insight, is why competition is important. And competition can be brutal. People can get wiped out, businesses can get wiped out. I always tell, competition should be strong enough to keep me on my feet, but not so strong that it knocks me off my feet. Right? Because you want to be alert all the time, because somebody can scoop your business. But you don't want competition to be so strong that you will get wiped out. Of course, the nature of business is such that it will wipe you out sometimes if you're not anticipating a new product or a new innovation. But competition is what keeps everything in check. The last point, which doesn't get as much attention, was his insight that cities and villages in those times on the coast were wealthier than hinterland cities. This became his treatise for why international trade was so important. And it was an interesting observation. A coastal city like Chennai, coastal cities have always done better. Part of it is because they attract entrepreneurs, they attract risk-taking behavior. But the third element, which is what Smith was using to make his point, was they promoted trade. So trade allowed you to expand your horizons. Now, of course, we coming from India view trade after this period of Smith in a very bad way, because after all, we were dominated on the pretext of trade. I always remind everybody who forgets the history that first East India Trading Company came as a trading company. And East India Trading Company landed in Fort St. George in Chennai as a trading company. And it was the largest trading company in the world with the largest, it was a private company, but imagine, a private company that had the largest military backing it. Right? So for the longest time, it was not surprising that when we talk about trade in India, we always don't like the idea of trade because we were dominated with trade. Trade came first and then comes the flag with Queen Victoria in 1857, right? Then only we became a formal part of the British Empire. But prior to that we were, so when after 1947, after independence, it was not surprising that India is a very closed economy because we didn't want to once again fall prey to another disaster with trade. But in Smith's world, this was just before colonialism starts, trade was an avenue, was an outlet for excess production, for raw materials, and trade was one of the transmission mechanisms by which you created wealth. Right? So there's the invisible hand, there was the competition philosophy, and there was international trade. At the same time, what the Industrial Revolution did was it unleashed man's creative genius for technological change. It is not that prior to 1750 we didn't have technologies. One of the biggest technologies was the wheel or agriculture, but they happened over centuries. What has happened in the last 300 years is an incredible amount of explosion of technical change. And the way an economist defines technology is very simple. It doesn't have to be just fancy mics and gadgetry and electronics. A technology is anything that makes an existing resource more productive. Right? So that's the most fundamental definition of technology, which of course encompasses all the modern technical things that we take as given as technology. So the pace at which technology has evolved in the last 300 years is mind-boggling and bewildering. And we have no idea where this is going to end. Because as I said, we are in the midst of the third wave, and I want to briefly talk about the previous two waves. So at the same time as the world has gotten more and more connected, and this is what we call globalization. In the 18th century, I refer to that as globalization 1.0, where it was really countries trading with countries. Right? So if you read books about that account of those periods, it was cloth and being put on ships and ships sailing and exchanging for spices, and it was physical goods being traded between countries. Around the middle of the 19th century, with the birth of modern corporations or joint stock companies, at the same time as ships became more advanced and electricity gets invented and the automobile gets invented and the plane gets invented, the airplane, technology starts to conquer distance, right? So we call this the death of geography. Distances don't matter anymore because more and more companies can go far-flung places that previously technology prevented you from going. And globalization 2.0 is when companies start to become big players on the national stage or the international stage. And that expansion has continued into this 21st century, right? So I just came on a flight recently. It was a British Airways flight, and you know the in-flight magazine, I was just sitting and reading it. The first paragraph was exactly what we're talking about. It starts off the following way. It says, the precursor to the British Airways was British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC. Many of you might remember that. BOAC was an English company that had worldwide roots. British Airways is a global company that just happens to be headquartered in England. Right? So just let me review that quotation. BOAC was an English company that operated worldwide. British Airways is a global company that just happens to be headquartered in England. Right? Look how the company thinks of itself. It no longer thinks of itself as an English company. It is a global company. So with the interplay between trade, technology, and telecommunications, what has happened in globalization 2.0 is companies have now transcended boundaries. Right? All big companies that you hear about have transcended boundaries. Yes, they may be called American companies, they may be called Japanese companies, they may be even called Indian companies, but clearly the battlefield or the playing stage or whatever metaphor you want to use for companies is the global stage. Right? Shakespeare said the world is a stage and we're all actors. That is how companies view the world. They're not constrained by domestic boundaries anymore. And Indian companies are very quickly flexing their muscles, right? So it's very nice in a patriotic sense when you go abroad and you see Tata owning Jaguar and Land Rover now, right? The ultimate poke in the English face when you say we go back and own the icons of the British Empire is an Indian company buying out Tata's, buying out Jaguar and Land Rover. Or TVS Motors, a local company in Tamil Nadu, is now selling motorcycles in Indonesia and everywhere, right? So Indian companies are very quickly also, when given the opportunity, Infosys, Wipro, you name it, TCS, name it, they're becoming global companies. At the same time, in the last 150 years, as companies are getting more and more globalized, there's this interesting tension because the way they behave still has them wanting to respect national boundaries. Where you pay your taxes, and where do you hire your employees, where do you repatriate profits, and how. But this is tension that's constantly, the boundaries are being pushed at multiple times. So economic forces are becoming global, and national, political, and social forces still remain very community-oriented and very national state-oriented. And I'll come back to this point. The third wave of globalization, which is where we are currently in, this started with the IT revolution. And I don't mean just the standard desktop that Microsoft popularized and then Apple popularized. The revolution that we are yet witnessing is the connectivity that happens between people as a result of digitization, miniaturization, and the mobile revolution that is still unfolding. So everything that can be traded across a fiber optic line, that can be bought and sold across a fiber optic line, or can be done wirelessly, is going to get done wirelessly. So it's the people-to-people connectivity that is the hallmark of what one calls globalization 3.0. Right? So in the 18th century, it was nations to nations. In the second wave of globalization, it was companies to companies, and now it is part of people. And I don't mean the social media networking that happens on Facebook and WhatsApp. I'm talking of people actually connecting for business reasons, people to people, without ever seeing them physically, is happening because technology is now making it happen. And moreover, this idea that a good from start to finish can be made in a physical place is becoming a thing of the past. Right? So more and more companies now focus on what is the value added. The way I visualize the global economy is like a series of supply chains and assembly lines cutting across national boundaries. And as it cuts over your national boundary, you make this many parts for the car, and then you send it off somewhere else to repackage and refinish, and then somewhere else. Right? So the idea that a product can be made from start to finish in one physical location is also